Hello, this is Kevin with Custom Micro, and today I'm going to take you along for the ride as we configure this FS S5500-48T 6SP-R Layer 3 switch. Let's do it. You may recall from our overview video that these are stackable switches, and if you haven't seen our video on how to set up the switch stack, make sure you go and watch that video. We'll leave a link to it in the description. Just keep that in mind as we go through the graphical user interface and we're configuring ports, that you'll see more than just the 54 ports of the top switch. Just like with our recent Layer 2 Plus switch configuration guide, the default IP address of this switch, and in this case the switch stack, is 192.168.1.1. You'll need to set the network adapter on your laptop or computer to be on the same subnet. So I've already got that pulled up in the web browser, and we'll log in and get started. The default username is admin, default password is admin, and we'll log in. Now that we're logged into the switch, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and give the switch a name. So under basic config, host name, you can name it whatever you'd like. Apply that. Under clock management, you can go ahead and set up your time zone. You can also set up your NTP servers. We're going to skip that step, but it's very self-explanatory. We're going to skip over port config at this time and go straight into L2 config. The first thing we need to do is create our VLANs. So we've got that pulled up here. You notice the default VLAN 1 is already there, so I'm going to click Add. And then we can add a VLAN ID and a name. So we're going to add VLAN 10, give it a name, call it Inside Wired. We could go ahead and tag or untag that appropriately, but we're just going to go ahead and say Apply. And we're just going to rinse and repeat until we get all these accomplished. It was that simple. Now we've created our VLANs and we've labeled them appropriately. So the next thing we need to do is go into our Layer 3 configuration, and we're going to go ahead and set up our VLAN interfaces and IP addresses. So we're going to go ahead and click Add. This is going to be for VLAN interface 10. Manual config. We'll put in our IP address. For this example, we'll do 10.100.10.1. In the subnet mask, 255.255.254.0. That gives us additional IP addresses. And that's it. We can click Apply. So there's VLAN 10, our routed VLAN interface. So we'll click Add, and we'll do the same thing with our other VLANs. 10.100.20.1, 255.255.254.0, and Apply. Okay, and just that easily, we have our routed VLAN interfaces configured. You'll see the IP addresses that are assigned to those different VLANs. And so now we basically utilize one of those Layer 3 routed functionalities of this switch. So the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is set up our DHCP server. And it's right there in the next tab over. We're going to enable DHCP, and we're going to apply that. Now that DHCP has been enabled, we're going to go over to our address pools, and we're going to add the address pools. The first thing we'll do is give the DHCP address pool a name. We'll call this one Inside Wire to go along with VLAN 10. The network number is going to be 10.100.10.0. The net mask, again, is 255.255.254.0. And of course, the gateway is going to be 10.100.10.1. Now we're going to add our address range. And we're going to allow IPs to be dynamically assigned all the way from 10.100.10.50 all the way to 10.100.11.254. Gives a lot of IPs that can be dynamically assigned. Here we also want to set our DNS, and for this example, we'll just set up Google's DNS servers. And if you need to change the address lease time, you can do that here. So we'll make those changes and we'll click apply. And so there's our first DHCP address pool, and we'll just rinse and repeat for the remainder. I'll make a mention at this point. You noticed on the second DHCP address pool, I forgot to set my DNS. So we're going to hit edit and go ahead and add those in there at this time. Another important thing to note is if you do need to edit one of your DHCP address pools, like we were doing, make sure that you change this address range back to add, or it will delete it. So we need to add that back 10.100.20.50 all the way to 10.100.21.254 and hit apply. And there we are, we're good to go. So let's keep moving along with our last two VLANs. It's a good idea to periodically go up here and click Save All from the graphical user interface. One quick thing before we move on, I realized I forgot two of my VLANs I need to create. Earlier we created those VLANs one at a time manually. There's also underneath L2 config, VLAN config, there is a VLAN batch config that actually makes this a lot easier. And so I need to create one for my transit VLAN. This is the VLAN that all the routed traffic from this core switch stack will go to. And we'll just create that and make it something quite a bit different. Let's make that VLAN 200. And then also, you notice we can just add additional VLANs with a dash or with a comma separated. I'm going to create also a VLAN for my servers that will be at this location. I'm going to make that VLAN 5, so I'll do 5, 200 and click apply. I'm going to go back to VLAN config. You now see those two VLANs have been configured. Now, it does not automatically give them a name, so if you want to name them, you need to go back and hit edit, and I'll just call this servers. Apply that, and then go into VLAN 200 and edit it and call this the transit VLAN. So now that we've created those two additional VLANs, the next thing we need to do is set up some access and trunk ports on the switch. Let's do that now. We're already in the L2 VLAN config section. Now we need to go to interface VLAN attribute config. We're not going to change port 1 because that's the port I'm currently plugged into. I don't want to lose my access at this time. So let's do this. Let's grab port 2, go into detail under operate. We're going to change the primary VLAN ID to be 10. We're going to leave it the mode as access. The VLAN allowed range, of course, will only be 10. And then the untagged is also 10. And we'll click apply. And there we go. VLAN 10 is now untagged on port 2 of the switch. Its mode is an access port. Now, because we're using port 53 and 54 on this switch is our stacking ports for the switch stack, let's go back and set up port 52 on the top switch to be our trunk port for that, or that transit interface, if you will. So let's go down. We'll take switch 1, port 52, go to detail. We're going to change this. We'll make the primary VLAN ID to be 200. We'll leave the mode as access. Again, the allowed range in the untag will match as 200. And apply that. And now all traffic will pass through that after we create that default route, which we'll do in a moment. But now let's say that you have another port, maybe it's for a wireless access point, you need to pass some additional traffic through there. Let's take, and we'll say port 10 on the top switch. We'll edit that. And let's say our inside wireless, if you remember, was VLAN 20. Our guest network was VLAN 50. So we have a guest wireless network we want to have on VLAN 50. So what we can do, but let's say we want to use the management IP address of that access point to be on our VLAN 10 we created. Let's say we want to use that for any wired connections, we'll make the primary VLAN 10. That'll kind of be our management IP or management VLAN for that access point. We'll change the mode to trunk mode. The allowed range will be 10, 20, and 50. Remember, 20 is our inside wireless VLAN and 50 is our guest network. And then our untagged is going to be 10. And we can apply that. And so now we see port 10, the primary VLAN, the PVID or the untagged VLAN is 10. The allowed VLANs are 10, 20, and 50. Let's do a couple more. Let's say a lot of our interfaces, maybe interface 3, we use voice over IP devices. But maybe we also might have some computers plugged in and we just want it to work accordingly. Let's make that a trunk port. We'll untag it on 10. That'll be the PVID. But we'll allow 10 and 30. If you remember, 30 is our voice over IP network. And when I set up a voice over IP network in those devices, I set up where they are tagged on VLAN 30. And so we'll apply that. And now that port is ready for a computer to plug in or a phone to plug in on that same interface of the switch, and you should be good to go. And let's say a couple more examples. Let's say down here on the second switch in the stack, just pick one at random here, port 25. Let's say this is going to be an IP camera. We'll leave that as an access port, leave it untagged on 40. The allowed IP is, or sorry, excuse me, the allowed VLAN is 40, and it will be untagged on 40. We'll apply that. So now down here on switch 2, interface 25, we have that as an access port untagged on VLAN 40 for an IP camera. That's how easy it is in the graphical interface to set up all your VLANs, your ports as access ports or trunk ports, untag and tag the VLANs as you need to. Now that we have a good sampling of VLANs that have been untagged or tagged, there's one thing I need to go back and do. Underneath L3 config, VLAN interfaces and IP addresses, if we're going to use VLAN 200 as our transit VLAN for all of this routed traffic to pass across, then we need to go ahead and set an IP address on that. So we'll click Add. The VLAN interface is 200. The IP address will make it 10.0.0.100. We'll make the subnet mask 255.255.255.0, and we'll click Apply. So we're saying that the IP address of this switch on VLAN 200 is 10.0.0.100. So if we had a scenario where we had kind of a hub and spoke connection, we had many sites going back to a primary data center, let's say this was on the edge of one of those, then we got to set up what the next hop will be for this to get out to the internet or up to other parts and other network segments. So the next thing we need to do now that that's set up is we need to go into static routing, click Add. We're going to create our default route, and so our forwarding address is going to be 10.0.0.1, and let's say that's our main core switch stack at the primary data center. And we can specify a description for that. We can call it primary DC, and we'll click Apply. Oh, looks like the description cannot include a space, so we'll take that out. Primary DC and Apply. So if you notice this default route is true, doesn't matter on the interface, it just matters that the VLAN is set up correctly. The next hop is 10.0.0.1, and there's the description. The next thing we want to do is set up an access control list, or ACL. This will prevent users on the guest network from accessing things on our corporate network. Follow along with me and I'll show you how we can get that accomplished. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an ACL. We're going to choose an extended ACL and we're going to give it a name. We'll just call it guest network and click Apply. Now we're going to select that one and we're going to edit. So now we're going to set up the rules for our ACL. Keep in mind that the order of these rules is imperative. So you'll want to go ahead and make sure that you start at the top of your list and work your way down, and we'll put them in the proper order if you'll do that. So we're going to click Add. So the first rule is going to be a permit rule. This is going to permit the guest network, that guest VLAN 50, to be able to get to the routed network that we created earlier. Remember, we created a VLAN 200, our transit VLAN, and we set up a default route, a default static route, and that next hop was 10.0.0.1. So in essence, what that rule did is it said, if there's no connected routes, we've not created any other static routes that would supersede that, send all the traffic out to 10.0.0.1 as the next hop. So we want to create a rule to allow the guest network VLAN 50 to get to that next hop. So we'll go ahead and choose permit. The source type is going to be an interface. We're going to choose interface VLAN 50. We could have also chose an IP range, and we can put the range of that network in, but for our case, it's just simpler just to choose the interface VLAN. The destination is going to be an actual specific IP, and that's going to be our 10.0.0.1 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. And then we'll click apply. So there's our first rule. Now we're going to create some deny rules to prevent the guest network from getting to our other corporate network segments. So we'll click add, and we'll choose deny. And then we're going to go ahead and choose our source type, again, as interface. We'll choose VLAN 50. And this time we'll choose our destination interface as VLAN 10. And we'll click apply. And you notice the order of the rules, it's putting them in the order as we create them, which is the reason we started with our permit rule. Let's add the additional deny rules to block VLAN 50 from getting to VLAN 20, 30, and 40. Okay, now we have our deny rules. VLAN 50 will not be allowed to get to VLAN 10, 20, 30, or 40, which are our corporate VLANs on this segment of our network. Now that we have our first 5 rules created, we have one more to do, and that's basically the catch-all rule. If the traffic doesn't match any of these first 5 rules, this will be the one that will take precedent at that point. So it's going to be an allow rule. So we're going to permit. The source type is going to be interface VLAN 50, and we're going to allow the destination IP to be any. This will be allow it to go anywhere if it didn't match those first 5 rules. So we'll say apply, and there we go. We have created the ACLs for our guest network. It will allow the guest VLAN to get to that next hop, that default route. It will deny VLAN 50, the guest network, from getting to any of our other corporate VLANs we created earlier. And then if the traffic doesn't match any of these first 5 rules, it will then allow VLAN 50 to do whatever it needs to do. We're going to go ahead and save all just to make sure for good measure. Let's go look under system management. Right now we're just using the default password, which is admin. So we can go in here and we can edit that, and we can set a new password. Just keep in mind that by default, the graphical user interface password is encrypted in the switch config. However, the command line password is in plain text. We'll show you in a moment how you can change that to be encrypted. So let's go ahead and we'll set a new password. And we'll click apply. All right, we'll log back in again. All right, we've got our password set. So we'll go back to system management. We have our startup config that we can export. In fact, let's do that at this time. We'll be able to take a look at that in Notepad++, and we can see a representation of what the config of the switch actually looks like. Okay, this is our switch config, and if you'll notice, earlier we set the host name. We have the spanning tree mode that's enabled by default and what mode it's using. Hey, here's our access control list, our ACL. And we see it's permitting VLAN 50 and then denying it to those other networks. All that set up just exactly like we'd like it to be. We can see some information here about the interface that I'm actually plugged into right now, which is port 3. I'm on VLAN 10 untagged. We've configured a few of our ports to do different and various things. You may recall that we set up port 52 on the top switch to be our transit port. That's where all the traffic's going to go if it doesn't match one of the connected routes, or if we didn't create any other static routes. We have our interface VLANs. These are our routed VLANs that we created earlier. We have our just normal VLAN list here with descriptions. We have our DHCP pools that we created earlier. And of course, DHCP is enabled. And SSH is also enabled. The one last thing I'll show you in the switch config is what I mentioned earlier. Notice how the password is stored in plain text. We'll show you in just a moment how to fix that. Okay, now we're in the command line interface of the switch, and we've already logged in. Let's take a look at our running configuration. The first thing we need to do, though, is we need to raise our permission level. So we're going to type the word enable to get up to that elevated prompt, and then we're going to say show run. We can hit tab, it'll finish that out for us, running configuration. We're just going to hit spacebar here. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that username for the command line, as I mentioned earlier, the password for that is in plain text. So we're going to fix that. But we'll just take a look here. Pretty much this matches the export of the startup config to a T. So you can always use an export of that startup config to help to use as kind of like a guide or a cheat sheet whenever you're changing settings in the command line interface. And if you ever have a problem with a command, usually you can type the question mark character and it will give you the options. I'll give you an example of that. Let's go ahead and go into configuration mode. So type the word config. If we type the word interface and then we type question mark, we'll be able to see the other options. We can either choose our normal gigabit Ethernet RJ45 ports. We can choose the T Giga Ethernet, which are our transceiver ports, etc. So for now, what we're going to do is we've got to fix that password issue so our password is not in plain text. In order to do that, we'll type the word service space password dash encryption and hit enter. Now the password can be set with an encrypted password. So let's do that at this time. So we'll say username admin, password. We'll make it something simple like password1 exclamation mark and hit enter. And now let's take a look at that running config again. So we can say show run, hit enter. And now if you notice, our password for the admin user is encrypted. And so that takes care of that problem. Just something you're going to want to do when you first set up this switch. That just about wraps up our video today of our configuration guide for the FS S5500-48T6SP-R Layer 3 switch. But before we go, one thing that I need to mention. Unlike some of the other switches we've reviewed in the past, this particular model switch uses the same username and password for the graphical interface as it does for the command line interface. On our review of the Layer 2 Plus switch we did recently, those passwords were different. There was a separate command line interface password and a graphical user interface password. So if you make a change to your password in the graphical interface, just know that that will be reflected in the command line. But also know you'll still need to go in the command line to set that password to be encrypted. If not, you can set the password all day long in the graphical interface, but it'll still be stored in that config file, that startup config, as a plain text password. So I would suggest you're going to have to log in the command line at least once so you can set that password to be encrypted, but just know those two passwords match. It's been nice having you along for the ride today in our configuration guide of this FS switch. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video goes out. We don't just cover FS.com switches, but we cover a large variety of different technology products, and we can't wait to see you next time. Goodbye.